So what we have is a demo application here that you can check out at fullstackjack.dev. The repository is open source. You can check that out too. And our goal for this video is to get the code from our computer, push it to GitHub, and then have GitHub automatically deploy it for us. And what it will do is we'll set up some GitHub actions, and these actions will be triggered by, for example, pushing to a certain branch, and then it will run a workflow. And that workflow will test the application, create the deployment artifacts. It will then push those artifacts onto our live server and prepare it for a release. It will then activate the release and then clean up old versions. That's what we're going to be doing right now. So in order to automate your deployment, you're obviously going to need some sort of server to deploy to. In this tutorial, we're going to be using a Linux server with SSH login credentials. And once you have that, you simply need to install Node, and depending on what sort of database you're using, set up your database. And from there, you'll need a service, which we're using systemd here. This is simply setting a file here. You can name the service whatever you want. Mine is called fullstackjack. If you create a file at this path, so etc systemd system, and then name it whatever you like as long as it doesn't clash with other services, and then .service. Once you create that file, we can take a look at it. It needs to have 3 sections: unit, service, and install. This says when the service should activate, so after the network is already there. We always want to restart. We also set our working directory, and then we start our node application. This file you could pretty much copy one to one, just change out whatever you want to call your service. And if you do that, then you will be able to call your service also using systemctl like that. But first you'll need to enable it. So you do systemctl enable your service, and then you'll be able to check the status of your service. So this service is what we'll use to always start our Nuxt application. So with that set up, let's take a look at what is on our server here. Our working directory is var www.html, which is pretty standard. The directories I'm about to show you are not directories you will manually create now. These are directories that will be created with our workflow. And we have our artifacts folder, which is going to be empty because we empty it after every deployment or in the deployment process. Then we have database, which is optional. This is only if you would like to run Prisma migrations. You have to deploy this separate alongside of your Nuxt application, because Nuxt throws out everything that's not needed, as far as I could tell, in the compilation process. And so your migrations are thrown out in that process. Perhaps you could set it to do otherwise, but I just simply decided to migrate it alongside it because it seemed like the easiest way to go. Then we have our live directory, which is actually a symlink. If I ls all, then you'll see this live directory is actually pointing to our active release, which is this big long number here is just the git hash of the last git commit. And that way you know exactly what is deployed at all times. We can always go to /info, and then you can actually see if we had a release. Right now, it's just, I just pushed to the server without making a release, so there is not a release that is active. And the git hash has pointed to the actual commit in GitHub. So that's a pretty cool way to always tell, and I'll show you how to set that up as well. If we were to cd into that live folder, we will see if we do ls, there's nothing there, and that's because the output is a hidden directory, and that output is what Nuxt compiles to. So locally, if you were to run yarn build, you would see this file show up inside of your project, and this is the file that is created in our GitHub action build. Let's see what else we have here. And the last thing is the releases themselves. And if we look, we always have 3 of them, and this is our current release. So that's what the live is pointing to, and the 2 most recent releases before that. So we keep the 3 most recent releases, one of them being live, and then that way we can roll back real quick if we need to. And we always delete the older ones in the deployment process. Also, I have Nginx set up. You don't necessarily need to use Nginx. You could use whatever sort of server you want, but if you want to see what my setup looks like, I'll show you that real quick. If I cat etc Nginx sites enabled, and then I name mine fullstackjack, you can see this is a very standard server setup for Nginx. I just say what the name that should be listening for, on which port it should be listening. I have my certificates here, and then we're doing a proxy pass to our Nuxt application, which is being started via that systemd service that I showed you. And I've used certbot to get my certificate. I have all of this also in a tutorial that I will link to in the description. Get those things set up, and once you have that, you're ready to automate. So let's get into that. All right, we'll start out in a Nuxt project, and then we will add a GitHub directory, github.github. Then inside of that, we'll create a workflows directory. And then here is where all of our workflows will reside. You can have many workflows, but in this case, we're only going to need one workflow, and we're going to call that deploy. And I will add an .int to mine, and you can add that or not, and then we'll end in .yaml. All right, now here's where all of the magic will happen. We'll start out by giving it a name, and we'll name this automated release deployment. And then from there, we want to say, when will this action actually be triggered? And we do that by setting the word on as a key. And then from there are many different possibilities, but in this case, we're simply going to trigger this action whenever we push to the branch main or to the branch feature deploy. And once we have that, we can start our very first job, which will be to first, we'll set some environment variables, the Nuxt version and the IP address. You don't necessarily need to have environment variables like that. I find it better because I can change them in one spot and I see them right at the top of this workflow. But then we're going to test our application. So each workflow consists of one or more jobs, and each of those jobs consist of one or more steps. And inside of those steps is where we actually run our commands. So if you'll see, this uses comes from GitHub. And if you go to GitHub and you search that, you can actually find the code for it. And we're going to name this particular step test application. And then we're going to also let GitHub set up our node environment for us by using that action, set up node. Then this with actually pertains to the node setup, and it says what node version we're going to use. And we're also going to cache yarn so that this job runs a little quicker. And then from there, we're going to just run yarn to install everything, yarn build to build the application, and then yarn test to test it. So with that setup, we can actually commit this. So we'll do git add, git commit, and we'll see show testing works, and then we will push. So once we have pushed, that means we have pushed to feature deploy, which we set up right here as one of our triggers, which means if we look into GitHub, we should see this job running. So if you go to the repository and you click on actions, we'll actually see we already have an action running right now. And of course, I've had a bunch of deployments before this tutorial. And we see that the test application is running for the last 26 seconds. And right now it's installing all of our dependencies with yarn. After successfully installing those dependencies, that took about a minute. It tested the application, which right now the application doesn't really have any tests. I just echo out test complete. But if you'd like to see some tutorials about testing, let me know in the comments below, and if there's enough demand for it, I'll make one. Then we run the post actions, and then it completed the job. So we have one successful job under our belts. Now we can get into actually building our artifacts for deployment. Now that we have successfully tested our application, we can move on to creating our deployment artifacts. At first glance, this job might look really big and intimidating, but if we go through it line by line, you'll see that there's nothing intimidating about it. The first key is needs. And what that says is we want to make sure that whatever value we set here is the name of a job, and we want to make sure that that job is successful before we start this job. Next, we're going to run on Ubuntu latest, just as before, and then we're going to check out our code. Then we're going to set up node. We've got our node version, we're caching again, and then we have all of our commands. Firstly, we're going to create a .env file, and the reason I like to do that is because I actually use the .env files in my Nuxt config, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But essentially, once the app builds, it's no longer reading environment variables. Those values are already set. All right, real quick, let me show you how to add secrets in GitHub. Go to settings once you're in the repository, and then go over to secrets and then actions. And then of course, you want to add a new repository secret, and it's just two fields, the name and the secret, and that's it. So anyone else using the repository will be able to see the secrets that are set, but they won't be able to access the values. Having that .env file built like this, I can use it during the build process. Then I can also save it to other places that I need it, because Prisma is also going to read from this .env file, and I can set that here on the server. And I can also set it where I'm running my migrations, because I upload this as well to the database, as I've told you before. And then I'll be able to use that env file in 3 different situations using one file, instead of resetting environment variables in every job and on the server. So to show you what it looks like in the Nuxt config, I'm using the process.env, and then all of these different values that I've set in that env file. Notice the git hash in release version. If we go to the app itself, then you'll see those are getting read from runtime config. And if we go into the server database schema, we'll see here it's also using the database URL environment variable as well. So that is why we create this .env file. I'll bring your attention to one thing and that is the appends here. These two right arrows means that it's going to append. If you were to use one, then it would overwrite each time. So if we didn't have two arrows there, then it would be overwriting itself every time. So we'd end up with only the very last variable. So make sure you have two right arrows. That's pretty standard for Linux. Then we're going to copy those env files to the places I've already said, and then we're going to zip those up. And that's what that tar command does if you're not familiar with it. In the Linux world, there's also regular zip files, but one very popular way to compress a file and to zip it up so there's less to transport over the network is using tar. And that's a very standard command. You can look it up. And we're going to name the directory the GitHub hash. So if, as we saw on the server itself, when we were on the server, we saw this long file name here. That is exactly that. That is this file that we are creating right now here. Of course, that will be unzipped, but that is the file name. And then we are also creating this database file as well. And we are calling it this. And this, what this /c does, it says is start from inside of this directory. And then I say, this is the directory that we want to compress. Then we are going to store those artifacts. So we have two sets. This is basically the exact same thing. One is storing the code itself. So this is our application code. And the other one is only storing the database code, this directory right here. And we're uploading that for the next job. And I've already run that job once. I saved it and ran it. And we can see that it was successful, and we will save time there. You already see that it ran through all of it. And one little tidbit is the .env. You'll see that those secrets are also, not shown in the runtime. So if you have other people in your organization, but you don't necessarily want to share the secrets with them, you can allow them to deploy, and they can even look at the job itself, and they can only see the things that were public. And the secrets are then starred out there with these asterisks. All right, now we'll move on to the next job, which will be getting this code onto the server. So far, we've successfully tested the application, then we created our deployment artifacts, and now we're going to prepare the release on the server. Just as before, it looks like a lot, but once we break it down line by line, you'll see it's very easy. The first thing I'll bring to your attention is that it also depends upon its predecessor. This needs says that we will make sure that the create deployments artifacts job is already successful before we start this job. We give this job a name, prepare the release on, in this case, int server. We're going to make sure it runs on Ubuntu latest. Now for the steps, instead of checking out the code, this time we're going to be downloading the artifacts. Also an action built by GitHub, something you can check out if you Google it. And we're going to first check out the app artifacts, which is the name that we named here. We said upload the artifacts with the name app artifacts. And then here we're simply downloading those exact artifacts, app artifacts, and database artifacts. Then we are going to upload those artifacts to the server. So when I say upload and download, here it's uploading it in the GitHub server so that it's available on this next job. So it's basically saving it somewhere so that it's built in this job so that it can be used in this job. You have to upload it in the GitHub server. Now we've downloaded it into this job, and in this case, we're going to upload it. This is our actual server that we're uploading it to, so our deployment server, just to make that clear. And in this case, we're going to use another action built by Appleboy. This is so that we can run SCP, which is copying over SSH. This is a standard Linux thing. If you've worked with Linux, you already know it right away. But if you're not familiar with it, in Linux, to copy a file or directory, you just type CP in the command line. And if you want to do that from one server to another over SSH, then you type SCP, and then you can give the file you want and then the target where you want to save it to, where you want to copy it to. This job allows us to do that within our GitHub action. And this with, just as before, we can pass things to this action. And we want to pass our IP address. You could also type it in as well. You don't necessarily need to use an environment variable. We're going to say which port, what user we're logging in as. It might not necessarily be root. You could be logging in as a different user. And in this case, I'm using a key. So I've already saved my SSH key to the secrets, just as I showed you before how to save other secrets. I've saved my SSH key there so that I can log in to my server with GitHub Actions. And then I'm going to say what file it is that I want to upload and where I want to upload it to with the target. Same thing here, exact same thing, except for we're uploading the database file, this database artifact that we created, and we're uploading it also to the artifacts. So I'll kind of blaze over that job because it's the exact same. So this step is the exact same as the step before it, just a different file being uploaded. Now we want to extract those files and create our directories. We're going to use SSH action from Appleboy to do that. So this allows us to run actions, so to run commands on our target server through SSH. And we will also need to give all of our credentials. And then here's where the cool stuff starts happening. We're going to make our directory and we're going to name it after our hash. Then we're going to unzip both of our zip files that we created. So our tar files, we're going to unzip those and we're extracting them to the end target here. So in this case, the releases zip file will be the tarball in this case. The release tarball will be extracted. So unzipped to var www html releases and then that big GitHub hash that we saw. Just to remind you, right here, that is this file being unzipped. And then for this one, we're unzipping this tarball to the root, so our working directory, and that is this database file right here. And when you're unzipping, if there's already something there, which in the case of database, there will be, it's unzipping every time to the same place. In this case, it's always somewhere new, so you don't have to worry about it. And in this case, it will always overwrite by default. So if you unzip to a file that is already existing, Linux will automatically overwrite it, so you always know you have the latest and greatest. Then we're going to remove everything from this artifacts directory. So let's see that actually work. So I'm going to make this site go down for a little while. Let me turn that off. I'm going to make the site go down for a little while because I'm going to remove everything in this directory. And then I'm going to remove all of the directories and we will see if we go to fullstackjack.dev, everything is going to be down. It's going to take a minute to realize it's down, but you'll see it's loading right now. Let's just restart systemctl, restart fullstackjack, and then we can check the status. We'll see that it's in fact broken. So we know that this next job uploading the code will be really creating the directories. There we go. We've got a bad gateway, but let's quickly get this code up and running. So git add, git commit, push app. And if we go to check out our actions, we will see it running. And when it's done, I'll be back. All right, it's gotten to the prepare release on the int server portion. And now it's uploading the artifacts. And let's check that out to see if we can see any of them. We can already see the artifacts directory was created. Ooh, let's see if we can actually see any artifacts inside of there. So we can see the artifact there already. We can already see it created the release and the job has completed. All right, that's a good sign. But of course, the code is there, but it's not actually live yet. So now we will move on to actually activating the release. A checkpoint here. We've tested the application. We've created the artifacts. We've prepared it on the servers. Now we're going to activate this release. Job's a little smaller, a little less to go through. That's great. So we've named it activate release. We're going to run it on Ubuntu, and we're going to make sure we're depending upon the prepare release on servers. Then we're going to use Appleboy once again so that we can SSH into the server and run our commands. We've set a couple of environment variables here. One is the release path, the other being the activate release path. We're also giving our credentials along with those env variables so that we can have them on the server. So what are we doing here? We're linking, this is creating a symlink from the release path, which is, that path with the big long hash. And we're going to the active release path, which is var www live. So that creates that symlink that we've already seen before. Then we're going to restart our using systemctl. We're going to restart that service. Also, because I'm using Nginx, I'm setting some permissions. I'm making sure that all of the files are accessible by Nginx by setting this user and group. You might not need to do that. You might have different permissions. That would be based upon whatever your setup is on your server. Then I cd into this database directory that we've created, and I run npx prisma migrate. If there are no pending migrations, then it will just ignore it. Let's run this job. Let's run these by committing them. So git add, git commit, so activate app. We'll push it and let's check it out in GitHub. All right, we see the jobs are running. All right, we got ourselves a real world problem. I deployed, but I've changed a couple things during the making of this video, and this activate release actually failed. But if we look, we can see it actually failed running the Prisma migrations. And the reason listed is permission denied. So one issue is that I should just use root here, and then that will take care of the permission problem, which of course I checked that a second ago. And while checking it, I also noticed another issue. The other issue is, so when I try to run Prisma migrate deploy, and I just run it manually here, it also failed even after the permission change. And that's because the Env file, this variable is not set correctly. So I checked here and went up to the create deployment artifacts. And then I noticed I just made a silly mistake. I used database URL, and in the secrets, I did not use the correct value. I just used this stripe secret twice. So if I go to my secrets, just to make sure of what I called it, secrets actions, I called it database URL. So that is in fact what it is called now. So I can commit, rerun the job. So now with this new fix in place, I will add the code and commit it again. And we will see if we actually get a clean run through for deploying the app. If you're new to this sort of thing, I just want to really drive home to you. It sometimes takes a lot of tries to get something right, and that's okay. I deployed this app a ton of times. Each page, or I think you could see how many times I deployed it. I've run 137 workflows. Of course, a lot of those were successful, but a lot of them were not. Don't get intimidated. Just keep moving forward. Just line by line, you will be able to build this up. Failures will happen. Mistakes will happen. You just have to do some troubleshooting and you'll figure it out. Ta-da! With those two fixes in action, we can look on the server. So I'll get out of here. We can see all of our code here. And if I look into releases, you'll notice we've already got 3 releases. And if I were to do another one, we would have another one, and then another one, and then another one. And these would eventually stack up so much, it would be a lot of space on our server. And also if we look at artifacts, because those aren't being cleaned right now that I think about it, we also have these artifacts, would eventually add up so much so that our server would eventually be full. So the very last step is to clean up after ourselves. We are almost to the finish line. We've tested, we've created the artifacts, we've prepared the release, we've activated the release, and now we're going to clean up after ourselves. We'll see we're running on Ubuntu. We're making sure the activate release has already happened with that needs. And then we are using Appleboy once again to log into our server. And this time we're only running a couple of commands. One is we're going to get everything older than the last 3 releases and we are going to delete them. And that is what this command does. This goes by time. And this -1 and +4 here basically make sure we keep the youngest 3 and anything above that we get rid of with this XRs. And then we're just removing the directories. With this one, we're just removing everything inside the artifacts. Now, these last 2 are optional. If you're running a private repository, you actually get a limit on how much memory you use as far as uploaded artifacts go. For this repository, it's an open source or open public repository. I haven't noticed that, but I have noticed it on private repositories. So you can delete those artifacts so that you don't run into that barrier and have to pay more. You can go ahead and delete those artifacts using this action created by Geeky Ego. All right, now we can watch this job run by committing the code. Let's clear it up, git add, git commit, and we will say clean up. All right, now that has been pushed, we'll check to make sure the job is in fact running, or the workflow. All right, it is. And we also have this clean up old versions there. And so what we will expect to see is once we hit LS artifacts, that will be empty. And although we are creating a new release, we will expect that if we do LS releases, that there are still only 3 because it will have deleted the oldest one of those. Hey, if you've made it this far, great job. Let me know in the comments what you would like me to cover in the future. I would really appreciate that. Thanks a lot. It just dawned on me while this job is running, I could show you something else. That info page that I've been showing works like this. So I've already showed you that in the Nuxt config, we have the git hash and release version. And then if you go into pages, we go to that info page, you'll see how I'm doing that. Essentially, I'm just getting I'm doing a split and the ref tag part I don't want. I just want to see the RC at the end. And I'm returning that here. And I'm just showing if there is a release, then show it. And also here, I'm just showing the git hash. And so that we can click through to it, I'm making it a Nuxt link. And then I essentially concatenate here. I just add the path to the commit, and then I give the git hash. And that way you can click through to the commit. And same thing here. I just add the path to the tags and then get the git release version. And that way you can click through to the release. I find that very cool to be able to do, which reminds me, I did not tag this. So I'm actually going to do, I'm not going to make you wait, but I will retag this and release it again so that you can see it. If you go to fullstackjack.dev, you will see there is a current release. If you go to fullstackjack.dev/info, you're going to see a release version here. It won't say not available as long as the most recent one that I've pushed is in fact a release candidate. All right, this job was successful. And now we can go and look at artifacts and we will see they are empty as we expected. And if we go to releases, it still only has 3 because the oldest one was already deleted. So we can see that that job ran successfully. I will see you in the next one.